Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your source material and really extract the most important nuggets of knowledge. Today, we're embarking on a pretty fascinating journey. It's into a concept that challenges our very notions of control, prediction, even what it means for something to be, strong. What if our most earnest attempts to fix things, to centralize, or to forecast the future actually make us more vulnerable? It's a surprising question, right?
Yeah.
And one our sources tackle head on.
It's a profound question indeed, and one that our sources unpack with some really surprising historical examples and, well, provocative insights. Our mission in this deep dive is to explore how understanding fragility, robustness, and anti-fragility, how that can offer a completely different lens, a lens to view everything from national economies, critical infrastructure, right down to our own personal relationships and careers. We'll show you why trying to predict the unpredictable might just be, well, one of the most dangerous things we can do.
Yeah, we've got some incredible material to work with today. Really challenges conventional wisdom and hopefully offers you a shortcut to being truly well-informed about thriving in what feels like a pretty uncertain world. Okay, let's unpack this. So we often assume that strong centralized governance and highly efficient systems, that they're the bedrock of stability, success. We build these massive complex structures, all designed to control and optimize. But what if the very act of trying to control everything, particularly from a central point, what if that inadvertently creates devastating fragility? It's a really counterintuitive idea, isn't it? But our sources explore it in compelling detail.
That's right. The material we're looking at today suggests a powerful paradox. Sometimes a state's incompetence or even its inefficiency, that can be precisely what saves a system. Saves it from the grip of central planning and, modernity's pervasive overreach. This phenomenon, where an intervention designed to help actually causes harm, it's often referred to as iatrogenics. The core idea here is that centralized control, despite what might seem like good intentions, it can introduce a kind of rigidity, or rigidity into systems that ultimately leads to catastrophic failures, especially in something as vital as resource distribution.
And our sources dive deep into a chilling example of this principle at work, China's Great Famine between 1959 and 1961. This tragic event, as the research details, claimed an estimated 30 million lives, just staggering. But what's truly surprising about it, according to studies by Zinn, Nancy, Quinn, and Pierre, is that the famine was actually more severe in areas that previously had higher food production. That completely flips the script on what you'd initially assume.
It absolutely does. That finding is profoundly counterintuitive, isn't it? It directly challenges the idea that, a simple lack of food was the primary issue. Instead, what the research points to is a profoundly rigid government policy, specifically around food distribution, and an inflexible, unresponsive procurement system. So this isn't about whether there was enough food in the country as a whole, no. It's about the central planning exacerbating a crisis rather than mitigating it, turning abundance into scarcity through policy. And the broader context provided by the sources reinforces this. It states that a larger than expected share of famines over the past century have, in fact, occurred in economies with central planning. The chilling truth from China's Great Famine. It wasn't scarcity that killed millions, but the rigidity of central control. It just shows how well-intentioned interventions can paradoxically become the deadliest force.
So it's not just about an absence of resources, but the inflexibility of the system meant to manage those resources that creates the disaster. This makes me wonder if there's a perverse benefit to inefficiency in certain contexts, which seems completely backward to how we think today, where optimization is king.
It does seem backward, yeah. And that leads us to another fascinating, almost counterintuitive example, the breakdown of the Soviet state. The insightful author Dmitry Orly observed how calamities were actually avoided after the Soviet state's collapse, precisely because its food production, contrary to all optimization principles, was inefficient, full of unintentional redundancies. See, Stalin's relentless attempts to centralize agriculture, they never fully succeeded. As a result, every town often had staples growing right around it, local production. Now, all this might have been costlier in a purely economic sense, lack of specialization. That very local, diversified lack of specialization meant people had access to a variety of foods. They had local supply chains, even when central institutions completely collapsed.
That's incredible. So the very thing that made it less efficient by modern hyper-specialized standards, the lack of singular optimization, ended up being its saving grace when the central system failed.
Yeah.
It's almost like having a diversified portfolio of food sources right in your backyard, isn't it?
Yeah.
Rather than relying on a single, fragile, just-in-time supply chain stretching for miles.
Precisely. And to put it in stark perspective, our sources compare this to the United States today, where we burn an astounding 12 calories in transportation for every single calorie of nutrition we consume, 12 to 1. In contrast, in Soviet Russia, it was closer to a 1-to-1 ratio. This raises a crucial and perhaps uncomfortable question, doesn't it? What could happen to the U.S. in the event of severe food disruptions? Precisely because of its highly optimized and specialized system, a system that prioritizes long-distance transport, centralized processing. The paradox revealed by the Soviet breakdown is this. In the face of collapse, inefficiency and redundancy proved to be the ultimate stabilizers. Specialization, when taken to extremes, creates fragility. Local diversity creates resilience.
Wow, that calorie comparison is truly eye-opening. We build these vast interconnected systems for efficiency, but they seem to inadvertently engineer in fragility.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just food, Because of the inefficiency of housing in the Soviet state, people had been living in close quarters, often multi-generational shared apartments for like 3 generations. This fostered extremely tight bonds, a dense social redundancy. So during crises like the Lebanese War mentioned in the sources, these real local links meant people fed hungry friends. They sheltered neighbors, supported each other, which is starkly unlike the often superficial and geographically dispersed nature of modern social networks, right? Relying on digital connections rather than physical proximity and, well, interdependence. The Soviet system, despite all its flaws, inadvertently fostered a kind of social anti-fragility through its very inefficiencies.
It seems the core lesson emerging here is that centralized control, despite its intentions, often creates unforeseen fragilities, leading to disaster where local autonomy might have thrived. And this surprising pattern isn't limited to food distribution. Let's look at another nation often held up as a model of centralized success.
Indeed, France. For decades, France has been viewed as a paragon of a successful country, due to its top-down, Cartesian, rationalizing state with an oversized, interventionist government. This vision, dreamed of by figures like Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who advocated for strong state control over the economy. The puzzle has always been, why did France fare so well in so many fields? Growth, happiness, science, literature, even good weather and cuisine, given its ultra-interventionist culture. Could it be evidence that central bureaucracies are, in fact, favorable?
That's certainly the narrative many of us have been taught, the idea of a meticulously planned, centrally managed nation. But then you discover what our sources reveal from Graham Robb's discovery of France, and, well, the whole picture shifts, doesn't it? The revelation is that the national state in France was largely nominal for a very long time, despite vigorous attempts by figures like Louis XIV and Napoleon to truly consolidate power.
Exactly. Consider the linguistic diversity of France, for instance. In 1863, barely 5% of France actually spoke French. 5%. The rest spoke a dizzying variety of languages and dialects: Breton, Occitan, German, and Italian dialects in border regions. This alone highlights the immense difficulty in truly centralizing the country. There was nothing inherently ethnic or linguistic binding the place together, really. It was, fundamentally, just the property of a king and a weak aristocracy. And the infrastructure. Roads were notoriously horrible, making much of the country inaccessible to travelers, goods, and central authority alike. Even tax collection was a dangerous profession, requiring immense tenacity and sagacity, often relying on local strongmen rather than central enforcement. And Paris itself, supposedly the heart of this central power, it was barely controlled by the state. Louis XIV, the Sun King, famously moved his government to Versailles just to escape the unruly Parisian crowds and the frequent uprisings. The historian Jean Nicolas, in his fascinating book La Rébellion Française, even counts the culture of rioting as the true French national sport, a testament to enduring local resistance to central authority.
So the image of a tightly controlled, top-down France was largely an illusion for centuries then. When did it actually become genuinely centralized? What was the real turning point?
True centralization, as the sources explain, only began much later. It really took hold in the mid-19th century and continued into the 20th. Paris only became genuinely controllable after Baron Haussmann's radical urban planning in the 1860s, which involved demolishing medieval tenements and narrow, easily barricaded streets to make these wide open avenues, good for crowd control, military movement. And the country only became truly integrated and centralized after a long program of massive public works. Extensive road and rail systems connecting remote regions, widespread public schools teaching a unified French curriculum, and the widespread adoption of television, broadcasting a single national narrative and culture. This Napoleonic dream of integration, which began in earnest with de Gaulle after World War II, was only really completed during the reign of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in the late 1970s. It was only then that decentralization even began to be seriously considered as a policy.
Wow. This completely reframes how I've understood France's success.
Mhm.
So are we saying that a certain degree of governmental ineffectiveness or maybe even failed centralization can actually be a hidden strength?
That's a fascinating way to put it, and it aligns with the source's insights, I think. France might have benefited from its, say, 2 decades or so under a truly large centralized state, maybe. However, it's equally plausible it benefited from the happy condition that the large state spurred growth, and then, crucially, did not overstay its welcome, allowing for necessary adjustments. Its long history of failed centralization might have inadvertently built in hidden redundancies, localized strengths, a culture of self-reliance, things that ultimately proved beneficial when the state did eventually try to exert full control. It's not necessarily that ineffectiveness is good, but that extreme centralization left unchecked breeds fragility. That seems to be the key takeaway.
That's a crucial distinction.
Okay.
Okay, let's turn to another supposed paragon of large state success, the Nordic model.
Absolutely. The Nordic model, particularly Sweden, right, often cited as a paragon of large states that work. These countries are frequently ranked among the happiest nations in the world. Despite government spending representing a significant portion of their total economy, the common narrative is that this happiness, prosperity, success, it's a direct result of their large, centralized, often progressive governments.
Yeah, that's a widely accepted view, almost a textbook example for some. But our sources suggest this narrative, too, might be largely false, or at least incomplete.
It is, according to research by my co-author and political scientist Mark Bly, who has extensively studied these systems. He showed me that the story here is almost identical to Switzerland, actually, which also has a robust, localized structure. The state in these Nordic countries, it largely acts as a tax collector, centralizing revenue, yes. But crucially, the money is then spent and managed by the communes themselves. These are essentially local municipalities. This spending is directed locally, for things like skills training, determined by the community itself, to respond directly to private demand for workers and local economic needs. In fact, economic elites in these countries often have more freedom and less bureaucratic interference than in most other democracies, precisely because so much decision-making is delegated down to the local level.
Huh. So it's far from the top-down socialist model outsiders often assume. It's actually a fascinating case of gaining from what looks like disorder, or maybe more accurately, deep decentralization, allowing for flexibility.
Exactly. And the sources further illustrate this point. They point out that the Nordic countries faced a severe recession around 1990. After the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, they responded admirably with policies of fiscal toughness, meaning strict budgetary discipline, responsible spending. And this effectively shielded them from the severe global financial crisis that hit about 2 decades later. Their decentralized approach allowed for this kind of adaptability and resilience. Local communities could make faster, more appropriate adjustments. This is a crucial distinction from centralized planning. In contrast, our sources note that in India, for example, national cabinet ministries still handle finance bills, 5-year plans, other major policies, which tends to lead to biases at the central level. I mean, someone sitting in a cabinet office in New Delhi simply doesn't know what works or what is needed at the periphery in a village thousands of miles away.
Okay, so let me get this straight.
Yeah.
Tax collection is centralized, but tax distribution and spending are profoundly decentralized. It's a fundamental difference, and it seems to create resilience.
It is fundamental. This decentralization of distribution and decision-making allows local cultures and unique needs to be preserved. It prevents everyone from becoming the same, thinking the same, or chasing the same big money dreams. For example, think about our great-grandfathers. They might have been experts in wildly different, highly specialized local crafts or knowledge bases, right? But today, what are we doing? We're all learning AI, cybersecurity, semiconductors. It feels like it sometimes. A child sitting in Silicon Valley or New York is often pursuing the exact same knowledge as a child in Germany or India, reading the same textbooks, striving to emulate a singular globalized ideal because everyone is chasing the same perceived big money opportunities. This approach leaves less room for local identities, unique skills, diverse expertise, which can be a vital source of strength and systemic diversity. What's truly fascinating here is how these examples, China, Soviet Russia, France, the Nordics, challenge our deeply ingrained assumptions. We're often taught that efficiency and control are paramount, Yet we're seeing compelling evidence that redundancy, localized decision-making, and even a degree of inefficiency can actually build a more robust and adaptable system. which raises a really important question. If control leads to such surprising fragility, what does that mean for our attempts to predict the future, an activity we seem utterly obsessed with?
We truly do live in a world obsessed with prediction, don't we? From economic forecasts to political polling, weather apps, investment algorithms, we crave certainty about what's coming next. We constantly ask what's next and when will it happen. But our deep dive suggests this obsession isn't just misguided. It can be downright dangerous.
Indeed. The sources argue quite forcefully that attempts to predict rare, high-impact events, what are often called black swans, are fundamentally futile. And perhaps worse, they can lead to a false sense of security, often with grave consequences. The fundamental flaw, the material points out, is that when things fail, whether it's a bridge or a financial system, we often blame poor forecasting, rather than recognizing the inherent fragility of the system itself.
Yeah, it's like that vivid bridge analogy the source provides, isn't it?
Yeah.
If a bridge collapses, it's unintelligent to blame the last truck for bringing it down. The bridge was already fragile, likely overstressed. It's equally foolish to try to predict which specific truck out of millions will be the one to finally bring it down. The focus should be on the bridge's integrity, right? Not the traffic schedule.
Precisely. And this has chilling real-world application. Think about President Obama's reaction in 2011 to the Egyptian revolution. He publicly blamed intelligence failure for not predicting it. But the source argues this missed the point entirely. The issue isn't failing to see the last grain of sand, that specific immediate catalyst like a street vendor's self-immolation. No, it's the suppressed risk lurking in the statistical tails of a complex system, those deep-seated societal pressures and fragilities. There was an underlying fragility that made the system vulnerable to any trigger, not just a specific one that could be forecasted. And we see a similar parallel in economics after the 2008 financial crisis, right? Many believed that if we had just predicted the subprime mortgage meltdown, we could have prevented the crisis. But as the source explains, the meltdown was a symptom of the crisis, not its underlying cause. The true cause was systemic fragility within the financial architecture itself. Obama's mistake perfectly illustrates this illusion of local causal chains, confusing a catalyst for a cause. And assuming one can predict which catalyst will produce which effect, it's often impossible. The upheaval in Egypt was unpredictable for all observers, even those directly involved, because the system was already at a breaking point. And the costly illusion of this is that governments, corporations, individuals, we waste billions trying to predict events that arise from interdependent systems. Systems which are inherently statistically incomprehensible at the individual event level.
Right. This challenge to prediction isn't just theoretical. The Arab Spring offers another stark, real-world example of how we often misinterpret causes and consequences. We hear those initial explanations, like the riots in Tunisia and Egypt, being attributed simply to, say, rising commodity prices.
And that explanation, while seemingly plausible on the surface, it just falls apart when you examine it closely, which the sources meticulously do. Bahrain and Libya, for example. Wealthy countries that could easily afford imported grain, yet they too experienced significant unrest. Furthermore, high commodity prices had occurred just a few years earlier, 2007, 2008, without any uprisings at all. So why then? The source argues that the focus on commodity prices was simply wrong, even if the logic felt comforting and easy to grasp. The deeper truth is that it's the system and its underlying fragility that must be studied and addressed. Not merely the immediate events or apparent catalysts. It's kind of like percolation theory in physics, which studies how things spread or flow through a complex, often random, highly interconnected landscape. It focuses on the properties of the terrain itself, rather than trying to predict the path of a single droplet.
So it's not about predicting the next trigger, but understanding the system's susceptibility, its fragility. And our sources even take aim at what they call spurious analogies used to justify prediction, especially when vast sums of money are involved.
Yes, the critique is sharp there. Mark Abdelhan, from a contractor selling predictive analytics to the U.S. government, for instance, he once made an analogy regarding Egypt policymaking being like blackjack, where, a 4% better edge makes you real money. The source calls this analogy spurious, arguing there is simply no 4% better on Egypt. It's not a casino game. This isn't just money wasted. It's the construction of false confidence based on an erroneous, oversimplified focus. The intelligence analysts, it's noted, made the same fundamental mistake as the risk management systems that famously failed to predict the 2008 economic crisis, offering the exact same excuses when they failed. The truth, stated unequivocally in the sources, is that political and economic tail events, those rare high-impact occurrences at the extreme ends of statistics, are truly unpredictable. Their probabilities cannot be scientifically measured. No matter how many millions are spent on sophisticated research. Predicting revolutions is just not the same as counting cards in blackjack. Humans will never be able to turn politics and economics into the attractable randomness of a game like blackjack, where the probabilities are calculable and manageable.
Okay, this raises a really important question then. If predicting these events is impossible, what harm do our continued attempts to do so actually cause? Sounds like it's more than just a waste of resources.
Oh, the harm is significant because forecasting isn't neutral. It can be downright injurious to risk takers. It actively encourages poor decisions. It's likened to giving snake oil medicine instead of providing genuine cancer treatment. It gives false hope, false direction. There's an anecdote from 2009 that powerfully illustrates this. Taleb recounts his anger at Takatoshi Kato, then a deputy managing director of a powerful international institution. Kato was presenting economic projections for future years without showing his past accuracy, his track record. Taleb argues with characteristic bluntness that if someone cannot predict your person, or has a track record of failing to do so, they certainly cannot predict your future. This is highly relevant today, isn't it? In venture capital meetings where startups give optimistic financial projections without any evidence of past predictive success, or when politicians make grand promises about the next 5 years without acknowledging the track record of their previous predictions.
Right. So the key is to look at their past performance, their actual track record of prediction, not just their future promises. What's the broader track record for these significant predictions in politics and economics, according to the sources?
The track record in forecasting significant rare events in politics and economics is close to zero. It is zero. That's the blunt assessment. This profound realization, born from years of observing these failures, led the author to improvise a solution. Since we can't stop people from asking for or providing predictions, the goal is to live in a world where these predictions do not harm you. This frustration and the recognition of forecasting's futility led him to propose the triad of anti-fragility. Understanding fragility, robustness, and anti-fragility as a replacement for predictive methods. The idea is basically, I don't want to know my future. I want to know which part of me is fragile, which part of me is robust, and which part of me is anti-fragile. Because these attributes are already knowable now, without needing a crystal ball.
That's a huge shift in focus. Instead of trying to gaze into a crystal ball, you look inward at your own inherent qualities, the qualities of the systems you inhabit.
Precisely. And there's empirical harm to consider as well. Studies show that merely providing someone with random numerical forecasts actually increases risk-taking, even if the person knows the projections are random. Isn't that wild? It demonstrates the iatrogenics from forecasting. Imagine a company that receives random sales forecasts for the next quarter, even knowing they're random. They might start making aggressive hiring decisions or production plans based on a high forecast, only to overextend themselves when reality hits. This false sense of certainty, even if known to be baseless, leads directly to increased, not decreased, risk. We need forecasting hubris-proofing built into our systems. But what makes life simpler is that robust and anti-fragile systems. They don't need precise comprehension or forecasting. Redundancy, for instance, is presented as a non-predictive, or at least less predictive, mode of action. If you have extra cash in the bank, you don't need to predict which specific event, war, revolution, earthquake, recession, epidemic, terrorist attack will cause difficulties. You're simply prepared for any difficulty because you've built in that buffer, that margin of safety.
This really does shift our entire perspective. Instead of fixating on what's going to happen, we should be asking, what are we doing to ensure we don't fall apart when the unexpected inevitably strikes? So what does this all mean for how we build systems and even how we live our lives?
Well, the core principle here is truly profound, I think.
Right.
Rather than trying to predict events, we should focus on making ourselves and our systems robust to errors, and even potentially benefiting from them. This is the essence of anti-fragility. The true mission, therefore, it reduces to minimizing harm from forecasting errors. It's about having things that don't fall apart or even get better when we make mistakes. We've just reversed the entire analysis. You don't need to know what is going to happen, but you absolutely need to know. If something goes wrong, which part of you is fragile, which part is robust, and which is anti-fragile. These are things you can know and act upon right now.
It's about making lemonade out of lemons, right? Embracing that disorder and uncertainty can actually be a pathway to growth.
Exactly. Our sources suggest that history itself is kind of in the business of making lemonade out of lemons. Anti-fragility is how things move forward and improve under the continuous stressor of time and unpredictable events. Furthermore, after an event happens, a tsunami, an Arab Spring, an earthquake, a war, a financial crisis blame should shift from the inability to predict it to the failure to understand anti-fragility. In other words, the question shouldn't be, why didn't we see this coming? but rather, why did we build something so fragile to these types of errors when we knew the possibility, even if not the timing existed? Okay. Not seeing a tsunami or an economic event coming is excusable. Building something that shatters when one hits is not.
That's a powerful point. It's like we can't predict when the next pandemic, say COVID-25 or COVID-26, will hit. We just can't. But we can ensure our hospitals and support instruments are geared up to bend and improve facilities, so we don't suffer from a lack of vendors or beds at the last moment. We don't buy insurance based on astrology or trying to predict our exact date of death, do we? We buy it because if something goes wrong, this should be taken care of. It's a preparedness mindset, not a prediction one.
That's the practical application exactly. The project of enlightenment, as our sources put it, isn't about knowing specific future events. It's about being sorted internally. If I am sorted, everything else will be sorted. And this isn't just philosophical. It has tangible applications in critical sectors and, as we'll discuss, even our personal lives.
Let's look at some real-world examples that embody this profound shift from prediction to anti-fragility. The nuclear industry, post-Fukushima, is a fascinating and frankly sobering case study.
It truly is. Following that catastrophic meltdown at Fukushima Daiichi in 2011, caused by an earthquake and tsunami, the intelligent nuclear firms around the world didn't double down on trying to predict the exact probability of such a combination of events hitting again. Instead, they became acutely aware that they should instead focus on exposure to failure. How much damage could a failure cause? This makes the prediction, or non-prediction, of a specific failure scenario quite irrelevant, you see. This approach leads to building reactors that are small enough to be inherently safer, embedding them deep enough in the ground to withstand tremors and tsunamis, adding enough layers of protection around them like redundant cooling systems or passive safety features so that a failure, should it happen, would not affect us as much. It's costly, yes, absolutely, but it provides immense, tangible robustness and anti-fragility by reducing the consequences of the unpredictable. It's about limiting downside exposure regardless of what the next unforeseen event might be.
That's a fundamental change in mindset, isn't it? From trying to prevent the unpreventable to making sure its impact is radically contained. What about in economics, a field notoriously difficult to predict?
Another powerful illustration in economics is the Swedish government's focus on total fiscal responsibility. This happened after their severe budget troubles in the early 1990s. Instead of trying to predict the next economic boom or bust, they implemented strict budgetary rules, strengthened their financial institutions, reduced public debt. This disciplined approach made them much less dependent on fluctuating economic forecasts, allowing them to effectively shrug off later crises, like the severe global financial crisis of 2008, with relative ease compared to many other developed nations. This is the idea of becoming a non-turkey, not being blindsided by the unpredictable because you've built in inherent resilience, a large margin of safety. You've prepared for any large shock, not a specific one you tried, and likely failed to predict.
Right. So instead of getting caught off guard, they built a system that could withstand almost anything. This highlights a crucial distinction you've alluded to earlier, expert, the two fundamentally different domains of randomness we encounter.
Indeed. It's obvious to anyone, really. We can put a man on the moon, predict the precise trajectory of planets centuries in advance, even minute effects in quantum physics with incredible accuracy. Yet governments, even with equally sophisticated models and vast computing power, cannot reliably forecast revolutions, crises, budget deficits, the precise impacts of climate change, or even the closing price of the stock markets a few hours from now. Why? Because there are two fundamentally different domains. One is the predictable domain, where we can predict to some extent, often through robust scientific laws, repeatable experiments. The other is the black swan domain, where events are both unpredictable and consequential, massively so sometimes. The demarcation between these two is as visible as the one between a cat and a washing machine. They are entirely different categories. You wouldn't confuse them: socioeconomic, cultural, political life. That largely falls into this black swan domain. Much of physical life less so.
So a significant portion of our lived reality, especially in human systems, is inherently unpredictable, no matter how much data or how many complex algorithms we throw at it.
Exactly. The idea is to clearly separate domains into those where these black swans are gross, unpredictable, and consequential, and those where rare events are of no serious concern, either because they are predictable or because they are inconsequential. The randomness in the black swan event domain is simply intractable. It's fundamentally messy. It will remain non-measurable and non-predictable, no matter how many PhDs with sophisticated models are put on the job. There is a fundamental limit to knowledge in the black swan zone that can never be reached, no matter how sophisticated statistics and risk management science ever get. In fact, our sophistication often puts us ahead of ourselves, creating things we are less and less capable of understanding. More complex, more fragile.
And yet, despite this clear distinction, there are still opportunists trying to apply complex models to predict black swans, right?
Unfortunately, yes. Upon the widespread discussion of the black swan idea, opportunists have begun trying to predict and predictionize black swans, using even more complicated models from chaos theory, complex catastrophe theory, fractal theory, you name it. Yet again, the answer remains simple. Less is more. Move the discourse to anti-fragility. That's the core message. My work and the thrust of these sources is about where one should be skeptical and where one should not. In other words, focus on getting out of what's called the fourth quadrant, that dangerous zone where events are both rare and have massive, unpredictable consequences, like a pandemic or a financial meltdown. What's worse, because of modernity and globalization, the share of this extremistan, that is, a winner-take-all world dominated by extreme outlier events, is increasing, making predictability even more elusive. Success for an author, a company, an idea, a musician, an athlete. It's often planetary or nothing now, concentrating rewards in unpredictable ways.
This concept of anti-fragility extends beyond large systems in economic policy, though. Our sources push us to apply this challenging yet maybe liberating perspective to the most personal aspects of our lives.
They do. With a highly provocative thought experiment for personal relationships, one idea presented is essentially, don't assume an ideal partner. Be ready that they will be cheating you because that's a trend and that is how the world is functioning right now. So the logic here is that if you operate blindly, expecting an ideal scenario, you are fundamentally unprepared for potential shocks. You're fragile. The rule of law in relationships, according to this perhaps stark perspective, is that your partner is going to cheat on you, end of story.
Wow. Okay. That sounds incredibly cynical at first listen, almost bleak. How is that a risk mitigation principle, let alone a path to anti-fragility in what should be a relationship built on trust?
Well, it's framed not as cynicism, but as a robust risk mitigation principle for personal anti-fragility, a way to protect yourself from devastating downside. The source clarifies this with another bold statement. If you are not the person worth cheating, then don't get into a relationship. The meaning here isn't to promote distrust, exactly, but rather to make yourself anti-fragile to potential betrayal or any other personal shock. It urges you to operate at your absolute best, maximizing your health, your financial independence, your diverse skills, your personal resources, so that your own well-being and stability are not entirely dependent on another person's actions. It implies that you build yourself up to such a degree that others should feel that they should cheat with their partners for you rather than against you. Or perhaps, more practically, that their actions, good or bad, don't derail your entire life. It's about embracing the reality of human fallibility and the inherent uncertainty of life, instead of complaining about how the world functions. You embrace that reality and make yourself stronger and more resilient within it.
Okay, I see. So it's not about becoming distrustful necessarily, but about building such a robust personal foundation that even unexpected betrayals or any other personal crisis don't shatter you. It's about not needing the other person to be ideal for you to be whole and functional.
Exactly. The critique here is of utopianism. We cannot afford to rely on the...
This is definitely a challenging thought, but it brings the concept of anti-fragility right to your doorstep, doesn't it? Connecting it to the fabric of our daily lives. It's about building a life, personal or professional, that isn't just resistant to shocks, but potentially benefits from them. Transforming uncertainty into an opportunity for growth. #outro. Wow, what a deep dive. We've journeyed through historical famines that defied simple explanations, re-examined the narratives of supposedly successful nations, and fundamentally challenged the very idea of prediction itself. We've seen how centralized control can paradoxically create immense fragility, and how embracing redundancy, localized decision-making, and even a degree of inefficiency can build true resilience, and maybe even anti-fragility.
The core insight for me really is that profound shift. From trying to perfectly understand or control the future to diligently cultivating what is robust and anti-fragile within ourselves and our systems right now. It means accepting that unexpected events will occur. That's a given. And our strength comes not from predicting them, but from our ability to not just withstand, but perhaps even benefit from the disorder and chaos that life inevitably throws our way.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Perhaps the deepest dive isn't into predicting tomorrow, but into actively preparing for any tomorrow. by understanding your own fragilities and building your capacity to thrive in the face of uncertainty?
Yeah, consider this. What aspects of your own life, your habits, your career plans, your relationships, the systems you rely on, what aspects might be surprisingly fragile? Where are the hidden vulnerabilities? What parts are simply robust, able to withstand shocks without breaking? And, most importantly, where can you identify opportunities to cultivate true anti-fragility? To actually become stronger, more adaptable, more capable when things get chaotic and unpredictable? Where can you gain from disorder?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration has given you some new insights to chew on and maybe some new ways to navigate the unpredictable world around us. Until next time, keep digging.